Of all the tools and templates available to us as project managers, there's only one that I consider to be absolutely mandatory. If you're putting someone else's money at risk, if you're hazarding their reputation, you need to be clear that you can demonstrate that you've acted with diligence and appropriate caution in guarding their reputation and managing their money. And for that, the tool you need is a risk register or a risk log. So in this video, I want to talk about how to construct a robust risk register and the fields you can expect to have in it. Before I start talking about the fields that I'd put in a risk register, I have to say that this is a long list. It's a list of all of the core fields I would expect in a big risk register for a big project. That is to say, if your project is a small project, you may not need all of these fields, and it is far better to have a smaller, simpler risk register where you consistently fill in all the fields that are there than to have a big, complex risk register and you don't use it properly. So configure your risk register to meet your needs. You may not need all of these fields. The other thing to say before I dive straight in is that I'm going to divide this into 4 sections. Each section represents a stage in the risk management process. And I'm going to use a basic 4-stage life cycle of identifying your risks, analysing your risks, planning your risk management approach, and taking action. So part 1 of your risk register will refer to identifying the risks. And the very first field, and an absolutely mandatory field, I would say, is a unique ID or reference number for each risk. Because one of the purposes of a risk register is to act as a document of record and audit trail. And therefore, each risk needs a unique ID. Allocate it when you identify the risk and add it to the risk register. And if for any reason you take a risk off or you change the risk substantially, then delete it but retain the unique ID and never reuse that identifier. The risk IDs can be a sophisticated thing linked to perhaps a work breakdown structure or a risk breakdown structure, or it could be a simple numeric 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is my preferred approach. It keeps things nice and simple. And I tend to use leading zeros and give myself plenty of space just to make things nice and neat for when I'm sorting. The next thing you may want to consider is the originator of the risk, the person who first identified the risk. Why would you record that? Well, because if in recording the risk you use some shorthand that you understand at the time and then later you're not exactly sure what the nature of that risk is, you know who to go back and ask to get clarification. By the way, the originator of the risk is not necessarily the person who is responsible for managing it. It's simply the person who recognises that risk at the first time and causes it to be on the risk register. Another thing I'd say is once a risk is identified, it needs to go on the risk register. If for any reason you say, no, let's not put that on the risk register, then what happens if that risk really does materialise? Someone will remember that you chose not to put it on the risk register and therefore not to actively manage that risk. And now you become culpable. Next, I'd have a short description or title for the risk. This is a shorthand description that can display easily. As a result, it won't be a full description of the risk, so you will need another field for that long form or full description. And let this be a full narrative field that can accept a large amount of text. The more carefully and precisely you define the risk, then the easier it is to find an appropriate response to that risk. The next part of your risk register is about analysing the risks. And the first field you might want in this is some form of risk categorization. This may be linked to the work streams and the work breakdown structure, or it may be linked to a set of standard categories you use in your organization. For example, political risks, economic risks, social risks, technological risks, regulatory risks, environmental risks, security, safety risks. A lot of people like to characterize risks, but the question I always ask is, having categorized your risk, what will you do with that information? Will it affect anything about how you handle the risk? And if the answer is no, then nice though it may be to be able to sort your risks into categories, it may not be worth the effort of defining those categories. Next, and crucially, is some form of evaluation of the risk. You may just have a single field here with a high, medium or low, but it may be that you want something more sophisticated than that. And the main components of risk evaluation are firstly impact, and this may be a numerical assessment of impact, or again a high, medium or low type of assessment. The next thing is some form of likelihood, and unless you really know what you're doing with statistics and probability theory, I would keep this simple: high, medium and low, or possibly very high, high, medium, low and very low. And you may want to have some sort of proximity measure to recognise that a risk that could happen in the very near future, tomorrow or the day after, is one we're going to give more attention to than one that will happen in the way distant future, in a year or 2 years' time. And you may want a field with some form of consolidated risk score. Again, severe or not severe, high, medium or low, red, amber or green, or 1, 2 or 3. Doesn't matter what scoring mechanism you use, because again, unless you understand the mathematics of this really deeply, you want to be sticking to a mechanism that allows you to make decisions and not to drive quantitative evaluation. The third part of your risk register is about planning. And of course, you're going to have a field for your risk management plan. In fact, you may choose to have multiple fields for a plan with multiple components, different ways of mitigating the risk. If the risk is a higher likelihood risk and a higher impact risk, then one single mitigating action may not be enough. You may need a whole series of actions based on different strategies. Therefore, you may need several fields to hold this. Next, for each component of your plan, you need an owner, or ideally one owner across the whole plan to take responsibility for managing that risk so that it's less of a threat. Avoid the temptation as project manager to make yourself owner for too many risks, because you'll have no one to chase and you probably won't have time to manage them all. Workstream leaders, team leaders are ideal people to be owners for substantial risks, and experts and functional operatives are ideal for smaller, lower profile risks. The other fields to have under planned are planned dates, and in particular a field for the next planned review of the risk to evaluate the progress made on each of the mitigation plans, and to review your evaluation of the risk. And you may set a date for planned closeout, the point at which the risk is no longer a threat to the project. This is a target date for planning purposes and can be very useful. The fourth part of your risk register is all about action. And the first set of fields I'd have are about progress. So you would have a narrative field for status of that risk and progress on managing the plan. And against that status would be a date. Finally, I'd have a section of your risk register for risk closure. Again, there would be a status. Has the risk gone away? Is it no longer a threat? Has it been managed out? Has it ceased to be a threat for natural reasons? Has it materialized and been dealt with? what's the status of the risk, and the date at which it ceased to be a threat. So a good risk register will have a number of fields, but it won't have any fields that you don't need to properly manage the risk. But crucially, a risk register is a document of record. It's part of your audit trail. It is also one of the most valuable management tools you'll have as a project manager. So create a good, well-structured risk register at the start of your project. Use it effectively, and you will find your project is under greater levels of control, greater levels of governance, and therefore is more likely to deliver on budget, on schedule, and to specification. Please do give us a thumbs up if you like this video. I'm going to be producing loads more great content, so please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of that content. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.